What happens when a woman, long accustomed to suppressing her desires, finds herself drawn to a fantasy that threatens to unravel everything she thought she knew about herself? Babygirl, the film starring Nicole Kidman, has ignited powerful conversations about female desire, agency, and the rarely spoken truths of midlife sexuality. This film dares to ask, what if our fantasies weren't something to hide from, but rather a pathway to deeper self-knowledge and liberation? For many midlife women, this question cuts deep. As our bodies, identities, and relationships shift, so too does our relationship to desire, often in ways we never expected. I'm so excited to dive into these themes with today's guest, someone whose work is all about helping women reclaim their pleasure and step into their full erotic power. Trust me, you don't want to miss this conversation. Welcome to Pleasure in the Pause, a podcast dedicated to empowering midlife women to connect with their bodies, pleasure, and power in perimenopause, menopause, and beyond. I am your host, Gabriella Espinosa, women's health and sexual wellness coach, and it is my pleasure to be here with you. Today, we're diving into the provocative, deeply layered themes of Babygirl, a film that refuses to look away from the complexities of female sexuality. This bold and unflinching film has ignited conversations across generations, particularly among midlife women, about desire, vulnerability, and the often unspoken dimensions of female sexuality. From its opening scenes to its raw exploration of power dynamics, Babygirl challenges societal narratives about women, especially those of us in our 40s, 50s, and beyond. At its core, this is a story about the tension between longing and restraint, about the parts of ourselves we've suppressed, and the radical self-discovery that happens when we dare to explore them. Joining me today to discuss the film and these themes is a guest who brings immense depth and expertise to this discussion, Lauren Elise Rogers. Lauren is a certified holistic sexuality educator and embodied intimacy and relationship coach. She's the founder of the educational platform Sex Ed for You and is renowned for her compassionate and approachable style in navigating complex topics like desire, shame, and intimacy. I can't wait to unpack all of this with Lauren. So let's dive in. Welcome, Lauren. Thank you so much for being here today.
I am so thankful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, wow. I'm so excited for this conversation. As someone who's deeply committed to helping people heal and grow through their sexuality, I can't wait to hear your perspectives on the theme that the film Babygirl brings up for women. But before we do that, please, can you share with our audience a little bit about what brought you into this beautiful space of sexuality?
I would love to. So I came about with this work after a decade in maternal health. So I was working with folks from preconception through postpartum. And throughout that work, folks would come to me with sexual health questions, libido questions, things of this nature. And I always thought someone should work on that, but that's not my calling. That's not for me. And then fast forward many years, I found myself divorced and alone and questioning everything I had ever been taught, which was not much, about sexuality, because I am what I have come to know as a survivor of purity cultures. I was raised in a conservative environment. I was married at the age of 21. I was a virgin on my wedding night. So I found myself, again, single and alone, and wondering, well, if I'm not a virgin, am I a whore? What does this make me? And I began to do my own self-discovery. Never had any intention of coming into this space, but the more I learned and the more I became more aware of who I was as a sexual human, what my erotic mind even was, some of these things, I thought, ooh, I really want to know more. So I went back to school to become a certified holistic sexuality educator. And it wasn't but a few months into school that I thought, This is my next calling. This is what I want to do. And so I opened the doors to my business, Sex Ed for You, in 2022. Had no idea if anyone would understand the form of embodied sexuality education and coaching that I wanted to provide, but they did. And I now work with folks in person in Central Virginia and around the world on Zoom. And my care is very individualized, and I deeply enjoy helping individuals, specifically survivors of purity cultures. That's one of my niche specialties, but also individuals in long term partnerships, which is why I had a specific interest in the film Babygirl, which we're going to talk about today. I deal with a lot of individuals who feel uncomfortable with what is happening in their erotic minds and seek to normalize it and integrate it in an ethical and values aligned way so that they don't have to choose one or the other, so that they can be these flourishing human beings for as long as they desire. Because a thing that we share in common is this understanding that our sexuality does not go away as we age. We deserve to have flourishing sexual lives, again, until we are in the grave. And I deeply believe that this is a taboo subject and that we like to put women's sexuality in a tidy box. And I'm not here for that. So, yes, that's a little bit
Mm,
about me.
I love that. Thank you so much. And I say a big yes to everything that you're saying. My mantra is our sexual pleasure has no age limit or expiration date. So we are definitely on the same page with that. And yes, so many of the things that you mention are themes that come up on this podcast, themes around shame, around not knowing who we are or as sexual beings and what pleasure really means to us. I know you deal with women and couples across different lifespans. This podcast is specifically for midlife women who I consider mid 30s on up, who are moving into that midlife transition. So I know that your expertise and know how and really how much you dial into all these really intricate themes, subtle themes that come up around our sexuality are going to lend so much to this conversation. So you and I met on Instagram. I've been fangirling you. You've been fangirling me. We follow each other. I consider we're colleagues in this area. And yeah, you came on Instagram and started talking about Babygirl. You had just come out of the movie theater. You were in your car.
In my car, I couldn't hold it in any longer.
Let's start by setting the stage. Babygirl is a powerful exploration of female sexuality. It centers Romy, played by Nicole Kidman, as she navigates the complexities of desire, vulnerability, and suppressed fantasies within the context of her long term marriage to Jacob, played by Antonio Banderas. And this all gets played out in a relationship she strikes up with a young intern from her company, Samuel, played by Harris Dickinson. All these actors do a phenomenal job. For me, I was struck by how Babygirl challenges societal narratives around midlife women in particular and sexuality. It's so rare to see women over 40 depicted as vibrant, sexual beings, really owning their desires. And Rami's journey felt so raw and relatable in many areas, especially her struggle and shame to express her deepest desires with someone she obviously loves while trying to balance vulnerability and the need for control in her own sexual expression in the realm of fantasy that she felt compelled to play out. And I wanted to, from you, Lauren, your impressions of the film, what stood out to you, especially as a sexuality educator and coach?
Hmm. I want to just launch right in from what you shared because I really appreciated that we sat with this discomfort of the societal norms that we like to put around what women in midlife should look like.
Mhm.
And I loved from the start that even the clothing that she chose to put on her body had an inherent sensuality to it. And I loved it that we weren't putting her in a traditional business suit. There were satins, there were laces. We were seeing how she was embracing this life as a corporate executive of, and again, we don't want to give all the juicy bits away, but she was in a prominent position of power and yet still incorporated these sensual elements into her. So off the bat, I loved that. But then I really enjoyed how we got to see from maybe 5 minutes into the film the frustrations she was experiencing in her sexual encounters with her husband. I loved that we saw that there was obvious love and connection between them and that there were still sexual frustrations. So often in my field, I will see folks again and again come in and say, I don't know what's wrong with us because I love my husband. And they're just flabbergasted that we could love someone so deeply and yet be sexually frustrated. And I loved that we just right off the bat said, this is normal and let's talk about it. And I just so enjoyed it. I enjoyed watching the way that she chooses to find pleasure for herself and
Mhm.
that we were normalizing this right off the bat. Again, don't want to give any spoilers. And then there's a point later on the film. And again, I'm just speaking to what truly resonated with me so deeply is she is in a conversation with her husband, Antonio Banderas' character, and she is trying to share her deepest desires, her fantasies. And the way the script is written, I could cry right now, is
Mhm.
so honest and true. She's trying so hard to share the words. And yet, throughout the whole conversation, she still is never able to share the truest spaces of her erotic imagination. And I was so thankful for the honesty of that moment and that she didn't just eloquently sit down on the couch and say, so these are my wildest fantasies that I've never told you in 19 years of marriage, that she so struggled to share. Because what I so often teach is that as our safety and security and our longevity inside of partnership increases, the risk, the inherent risk of sharing our deepest erotic fantasies also increases. We are scared because the threat, the cost of that fantasy equaling rejection or being told that we are dirty or broken or something's wrong with us is that much greater. Sharing a fantasy with a casual sex partner is easy peasy, and there's not a lot to lose. But sharing a fantasy wherein your partner might choose to believe something about you is inherently vulnerable and risky. And I loved that we showed the human struggle there. And then last huge element, I love when we tell messy stories of women because I believe that we have so been like, oh, this is a woman's story. It's perfect and it ends in a happy ending and she's tied up in a box. And I love stories of messy women because we deserve to get to be messy and raw and real. And it's why I loved it.
Yeah. You touch on so many points that I want to talk to you about and peel here in this conversation. The messiness of it. I just want people who are listening who go see the movie or who have seen it, and if they felt uncomfortable with the messiness, to just understand that it's okay to feel uncomfortable with that messiness, because messiness doesn't always feel comfortable. I sat with that discomfort in some messy parts of the film, and that was a theme that kept coming up for me. Okay, she has this whole facade of being incredibly intelligent, dressed beautifully and perfectly. I also was just like, oh my God, the outfits that she was wearing and a long-term marriage, everything appeared perfect on the outside, but you saw the messiness of her inner world, right? You saw the messiness of her repressed desires. And really you saw the messiness of the shame she felt from holding those desires. So I found that this movie was really about liberating ourselves from that shame. And I think I did myself liberate myself from some degree of shame that I felt in terms of fantasies, right? So let's go there. I love how Babygirl dives into the role of fantasies in our sexual lives. Her fantasies are both a source of empowerment inner conflict, that right? From your perspective, why are fantasies such an important part of our sexuality, and how can we use them as a tool for our sexual empowerment?
Mm. You are speaking my language. This is one of my favorite things. I literally just concluded a session with a client where we were talking about the power of the erotic mind and the important role it plays. What I think is often not discussed is a thing Esther Perel became really well known for saying is that often our red light district or erotic minds are filled with things that we would sometimes demonstrate against during the day. So, Dr. Jack Moran, one of my favorite authors on
Mm,
the erotic mind,
yeah.
talks often about these four cornerstones of eroticism. And so, if your audience is not familiar with eroticism in general, I think that these themes really help us discuss fantasy. So, Jack talks about number one, the cornerstone of longing and anticipation, that thing that's just out of reach because there is so much excitement in the energy of moving towards something, of wanting something, of anticipating. So, that's cornerstone one, longing and anticipation. Number two, violating prohibitions, that little element of taboo of the naughtiness factor, incredibly hot and erotic. Number three, this search for power, which we definitely see in this film so much. This could be power over or power under. Any of these dynamics can be incredibly erotic to the mind. And then number four, overcoming ambivalence, which is my personal favorite, which is that thing that we have to work to earn, that working for, which can really get our erotic engines running. What I think is so important to discuss in fantasy is that they can absolutely be a pathway to turn on, to arousal, to desire, and yet they can also be a recipe for a very unhealthy relationship. So I find in my work that many of my clients have chosen a good partner, a healthy partner, a partner who is not ambivalent towards them, a partner who does not exert power over them or try to control them. And they come to me and they say, Lauren, I married the good one, and now my sex is boring. What do I do? And this is where I think that the erotic mind is the perfect playground. That
Mm,
when women in particular can give themselves permission to play in this erotic space, whether solo or partnered, whether they are enjoying this fantasy in their own time or sharing it with a partner, it can literally be the springboard into this magical world. I
mm,
say all the time that I love using the analogy of a springboard for erotic fantasy because oftentimes in athletics, we'll see a gymnast use a springboard onto like a balance beam. In our minds, we don't think less of the gymnast for using a springboard, but to have a pathway that gives us a greater access to our sexual expression. Oh my goodness, so wonderful. But where I like to caution clients is when we push our eroticism into the shadows, as our main character did for years and years, it is in the shadows that they take on often the thing that we most fear. By integrating our erotic minds into our lives, it is then that we can see it literally nurture the things around us. But if we do as our heroine in this movie did and smush our eroticism into the shadows, it will oftentimes take on the thing that we most fear. And I think it is critically important to be able to differentiate between fantasy and reality. And that can be such a fun conversation.
So, what advice would you give to women who are just beginning to explore their fantasies, or wanting to share them with a partner? Because we all have them, right? It could be anything as simple as wanting to try a new position in lovemaking or to try a different location. I think we're wired for novelty, right? Our bodies are wired for novelty. And so, yeah, when things get stale and boring, the mind can go into that place of fantasy and it brings up elements of shame or I can't share that. How can women start to begin to explore their fantasies either alone or with a partner?
Two routes. Some folks would like to take the route of sharing something else that they enjoy with a partner. So if you and your partner enjoy watching movies together or a television show, I would use that as an inlet. If you two already have a shared experience of viewing something else and enjoying the experience together, aha, share with your partner, you know how we're really enjoying such and such TV show. I would like to incorporate a little bit of that into our lovemaking. I would
Mhm.
like to share with you some of the things that go through my head that are really big turn-ons for me. May I do this? See what they say. I think it's really important that we acknowledge the fact that it was good old Freud years and years ago who made us believe wrongly that if we were allowing fantasy to occupy space in our brain while we were with another partner, that we were cheating and that we should only be present with the person we're having sex with. That has been disproven again and again. There is nothing wrong with us. We are not pathologically broken. We are erotic human beings. If your partner says, yeah, I'd love to hear what's in your erotic mind, please share. I invite you to share. If your partner says, that makes me a little uncomfortable, then share Freud being disproven. Or ask, what if I use these fantasies in my own mind, but just keep them to myself? That could be fine too. There has been this huge misconception that we are cheating if we are enjoying an erotic fantasy, and we're simply not. We're simply not. But then also, I love to encourage individuals to speak with their partner about this erotic equation, and that is attraction plus obstacle equals excitement. And it can be really fun in especially long-term partnerships to incorporate elements of obstacle so that we can increase excitement. So there are ways to, yes, share what is in your mind. There are also ways to figure out which of your four cornerstones are your biggest turn on and incorporate them in your partnerships. I spoke earlier of how overcoming ambivalence is one of my favorite cornerstones. And the way my loving partner, who is anything but ambivalent towards me, and I incorporate this in our sexual play is if I am in a little bit of a horny space and I'm like, baby, what you doing later? He will, because he knows that overcoming ambivalence is my greatest turn on. He will pretend, babe, so sorry. I just don't think I have time. Okay. That is the furthest thing from the truth. But it is a way that we play together
Mm. Mhm.
because he is understanding that my erotic spaces are to be explored, not to be extricated outside of our relationship. Yeah. So that's
Yeah.
the beginning. I could go on and on, but I'll
Yeah, no,
stop
that's
there.
beautifully. I love the way how you frame fantasies as this space of exploration, of curiosity and connection rather than something to feel ashamed of. I feel so many women, especially those of us who've grown up in purity culture, carry a lot of shame around these thoughts,
Yes.
these ideas, these
Yes.
feelings, these desires. So, in your experience of having grown up in working with women or couples who come from that background, what are some steps they can take to start separating themselves from the narratives they grew up around purity and their whether it be religious or whatever. Right now, I think of purity culture strictly as religious, but I'm sure there are other aspects of purity culture. You share that if you like. But then, I think of my upbringing. I grew up in a very traditional Latin American household. My parents came here from another country with a different set of values and ideas. So I grew up with a different type of purity culture. And what are some steps that whether they're cultural or religious, that we can take to sort of just distance ourselves from that, but still honor that? I still want to celebrate and honor my culture. We're not telling people to dismiss their religions. What are some steps people can take to do
Mm,
that?
that's my favorite question. And yes, to that purity cultures predominantly get labeled into this like fundamental evangelical Christianity
Mm,
box, and it is so much more. I like to say that it is anyone who had a restricted narrative and a tight set of moralistic sex education. Right. That
mm,
was incomplete and inaccurate at best, and oftentimes informed by certain morality principles that came from a faith background. So many of us would fall into a purity culture narrative that we grew up with, which centered abstinence until marriage. That's all.
mm,
I think one of the first things is to realize and acknowledge that guilt and shame are the number one cause of sexual dissatisfaction across the board. So, number one, giving yourself some peace, some grace. It's okay. Most everyone is dealing with guilt and shame at some point. Rami, in our movie that we're discussing, Babygirl, guilt and shame are the things that are keeping her from sharing her fantasies. We are not given any intel into what her sex education was growing up in her life. And yet we can see that guilt and shame are the predominant problem. So, what I encourage my clients to do, and anyone that I speak to, is first and foremost begin to understand the origins of your original beliefs around sexuality, sexual expression, your bodies, and the bodies of others. So, number one, do some kind of archaeological dig. Where did those original beliefs come from? And do you, at this point in your life and in your body, still align with those values? You get to decide. And if not, you get to create new sexual values that you truly align with. I tell everyone that I speak to that it is not my goal in life to make us all pole dancers and strippers. That is not everyone's path. Is it a sexually liberated path that we can see? Of course. But sexual liberation is going to look different for every single one of your audience members. And I protect and respect their right to decide what that looks like. And that is up to us as individuals, and it should be celebrated. I encourage enjoying the process of understanding what it might mean to be a person who has sexual values and a sexual ethic. And what does that look like for you? What type of expression do you want to have? What types of sex do you want to engage in? One of the things I did want to differentiate between in my lexicon, how I speak of sexual fantasy, and this is not everyone, is I really delineate between sexual fantasies and sexual desires. Sexual fantasies to me are things that we would not necessarily want to engage in on an everyday level. They're not. They might be a threesome. A threesome is the number one sexual fantasy of every human being in the world. And yet only 20% of people will engage in a threesome. And then I think of that 20%, 80% will say that the fantasy was better than the reality. So that is a perfect example of fantasies are not inherently something we desire to enact. I say this because of the purity culture topic that we're speaking about. So many individuals who were raised in some type of constrictive childhood can have sexual fantasies that are all about violating prohibitions. And that oftentimes can look like some inappropriate dynamic, maybe a teacher student, maybe some type of boss, like apprentice, intern type of thing.
Mhm.
Okay. These things that are inherently erotic, but in actuality would be unethical. And I think it is very important for every human being to have the freedom to delight in their erotic fantasy and be able to clearly delineate between fantasy and reality. What is healthy and special and wonderful and could be orgasmic in fantasy could be detrimental and could 100% be an abuse of power, an abuse of income, socioeconomic status, age, you name it. It could lead to abuse, and I'm not here for it. So I think it is really important that we give women the freedom to enjoy that erotic space and understand how it could be harmful in an actual situation. One of the things I like to share is, again, I grew up in this very patriarchal, misogynistic world. And one of the ways that my body has taken pain and turned it to pleasure, which is a research thing, is that some of my greatest fantasies are of being the center of desire of a much older person, and I'm in a younger body. This is
Mm.
wonderfully touched on in Babygirl because you see her in all of these therapeutic modalities. And one of them, she's doing an eye desensitization and she's doing all these eye things. And you're seeing her try to go through her childhood and figure out where this fantasy comes from. And research continually proves that, yes, sometimes our fantasies, our deepest fantasies, are connected to some childhood experience. Sometimes they are not. Sometimes they are just the result of positive information that our bodies got. Oh, this, I'm the center of attention. This feels good, right? I'm dancing at a party. This feels good. Ooh. what would it be like to be one woman in a group of men who all want to have sex with me? Well, that means I would be so desired. Well, we could call that a gangbang fantasy for sure. And we could pathologize her and say that she wants to be abused, or we could center her pleasure at the center of the narrative and say, oh, that's a woman who is loving being desired and she gets to. So again, I just like to differentiate between fantasy and a sexual desire, which is something you might want to role play, you might want to act out, you might want to go try a threesome or a sex party or some of these things, which are all lovely and can be done ethically. But I like to make it very clear to the folks I speak with that if it's something you just want to fantasize about, that's okay too.
Yeah, honoring our fantasies is key. And yeah, a lot of the film, you see her struggle with honoring her fantasy. I love the exploration in the film and a tension between control and surrender and Rami's journey, her fantasy between control and surrender, especially in the exploration of kink, right? So kink, particularly psychological kink, is so often misunderstood. For many, it's about whips and it's about going to your erotic edges, playing with power dynamics, and really marinating in curiosity about what's taboo or forbidden for you. But psychological kink in particular focuses on these dynamics of dominance and submission, which can create profound intimacy when they're approached with trust and consent. And I want to talk about that trust and consent in the context of relationships. But just to go back to this idea of kink, I love the modality. I studied a bit of the modality of the erotic blueprints that were developed by Jaya. And I think she did it. They were inspired by Jack Morin and his erotic mind. So kink or kinky is anything, right, that's considered taboo, out of the norm, or forbidden for an individual. And so, again, like that, the fantasy I mentioned earlier, it can be anything. It can be whatever is taboo for you. So it can be doing something other than missionary position, maybe considered taboo for so many people. So I just want to stress that a kink is more than the whips and leather and chains that we see in movies. It's really about going to those edges and exploring curiosity, who you are as an erotic being, and allowing that to manifest in power dynamics between dominance and submission. So we see that in the film. I'd love to talk to you about what you feel is this power dynamic and how can we enter this power dynamic of surrendering and control with communication, with consent. Those are such important elements to bring into fantasy environment, especially that involves kink. And you see that played out in the movie. I know you talk a lot about consent and would love for you to. And there's a point in the film where they're having that conversation of like, oh, what is consent? Like they're trying to figure it out, right? And
Yes.
so, and so it's a relatively new concept
Mhm.
still, right? It's a new
Yes.
concept. So what can you tell us about consent and how to bring it in to a relationship, especially I find it more trickier when you're in a long-term relationship and you haven't had that dynamic of consent. And all of a sudden you want to explore new boundaries in your sexual expression. And how do you do it with respect for the other, right? You have to have those consensual conversations. So what does that involve?
You have to. And I'm so glad we're getting to this part of the film because I loved it. There is an awkward moment in the film where the topic of consent comes up, and the younger character, Samuel, is trying to educate the elder Rami on this concept of consent, and she cannot understand it. She doesn't want it to be present. She wants him to just take over, and he is so good at saying consent is an agreement that must be reached between both of us. And I wanted to just pause the film and yell at everyone in my audience. That is a beautiful, simplistic description of consent. So perfect. Mwah. Chef's kiss for Samuel. He did so well at that. There were also other crucial moments where he kept asking her, what do you want? because he had an idea of, oh, okay, she wants to play with dominance and submission, the psychological kink. You described it so well. And then she couldn't share what she truly wanted because she had not done that work yet, which is why, yes, I went on Instagram. Please work with someone, everyone. You're not a hopeless cause. You can work with someone on these things. But I loved that he kept questioning her because the truest, most consensual, most fulfilling, most erotic experiences, kinky experiences, are led by the submissive who puts their desires forward clearly, concisely, with the amounts of touch that they want. I want to be spanked on my right butt cheek at 30% of your greatest pressure. So let's practice. Okay, nope, that was 50. Nope, 40, 30. That's perfect. That's perfect. Nope, slightly more to the left, slightly more to the right. I want it this way for this long. And this is what I want to feel. I want to, I'm not going to give it away. There's so many good pieces, but there's a dog moment early in, and she sees this, and this is in the previews, so I don't feel like it's giving a lot away. She sees him calm a dog, and her body goes, yes, that. I want to experience that surrender to someone else's dominance. But I want to equip your audience with the power to, you can say that. You can say, I want us to figure out a way where we can play with that. I want to be able to give over my power consensually in this limited time and space. I always encourage creating a vessel, creating a time and space to have this form of play, especially in long-term partnership, because this can be wild. I also encourage, if we are bringing up this up in a long-term partnership, to go into this conversation sharing that it is not a lack of something. This is really cool research on the female erotic mind. The more we have security and safety, the more we crave adventure and risk.
Exactly, yes. I
So
mean,
if you
I think fantasy is that, right? It is the ability to feel safe and trust and surrender. And so that's what the realm of fantasy is. And I love the way just the energy between the two characters, Romy and Samuel, and that beautiful epic scene in the middle where I have chills as I think about it. That
so
scene
good.
where they both get with that interplay of trust, surrender, and consent, they can just go into extraordinary realms of sexual and erotic expression. And it happened for her as well as for him. I loved watching him
Yes.
as well. He was also exploring that as well in the film. So it wasn't only about her, it was about the two of them and that interplay of trust, surrender, and consent and exploring their individual fantasies. And I just loved how beautifully it played out in that scene, that epic
Mhm.
scene in the middle.
Mhm. And so if I could have sat with Jacob and Romy, okay, at the end of the film or at any point in the film, I would have affirmed Jacob in that he had built such a safe and secure environment for his partner that she was now able to crave adventure and risk. I think oftentimes when we are the long term lover of someone, we'll go, am I not enough? Is what I'm doing not enough? But it is actually the opposite so often. It is that we feel the feelings of safety and security. And so it sets us free to want more. It is not a lack of, it is that we are incredibly erotic beings. Wednesday Martin's book, Untrue, is all about this type of research that it is not the men who want greater and more risky sex, it's the women so often whose erotic minds are filled with these lusty thoughts. And it is our greatest joy to get to share them and express them. And so it can be done in long term partnership, especially if we go in with this understanding of, ooh, what we have, safe, secure. Now, let's sprinkle adventure and risk in and see how much fun we have. And going back to consent, one of my favorite ways to explain consent is that at all times in a sexual experience, especially a submissive and a dominant one, someone is receiving a gift and someone is giving a gift. And it was so beautiful when they found their sweet part because they realized, oh, like this is the giving and receiving that is going on. And it was mutually beneficial for both of them. There were tears, there were requests to be held, there was all of this beautifulness that you can see. Oh no, this isn't about danger and I don't know. I think we get in this mind space that it is all grime and
Yeah.
salaciousness,
Yeah.
and there was tenderness too.
Yeah, tenderness and vulnerability, right? The vulnerability was just so pure. And it can be both terrifying as well as transformative. And you see that, right? You see how scared she is to really drop into that place of vulnerability. But then you see the transformational aspect. And so I feel I don't want to generalize and say it's only for women in midlife. I think it's for all women. It's for all humans who are navigating that idea of who am I as a sexual being requires dropping into that vulnerable space and allowing yourself to be transformed by it. But especially in midlife, when we're navigating so much physically, emotionally, and relationally, it can be hard. It can be where we just stop ourselves. It's just, I cannot go there. And so I just want to encourage everyone who's listening. Yes, we could have so much going on, but there is that vulnerability and those consensual conversations can be a pathway to so much freedom. They are truly liberating.
Mhm. And I think especially for women in midlife, like this is, we like to say, oh, she's this many years, she's got that many kids, she's this role, she's that role. No, no. Women who are listening, you are not to be defined by these labels and these roles that other people have thought to constrain you with. No.
Mm,
Our erotic imaginations have no time limit. They in fact, there's been some fascinating studies in women over 50 and in 60s and how it is like the richest time of their erotic life, and it is time to lean into these things. I refuse to believe this narrative that women are only useful for us in society until a certain age, where then we say that they are these dried up. No, no.
mm-mm.
And I love that Nicole Kidman is of the age that she is, and we are telling the story of a woman in midlife because that I think it is a crucial story to tell.
Yeah. Yeah. That felt very empowering and I loved it. I just wanted to, before we finish, I wanted to just another subtle but very significant theme in the film. And I'm going to try not to give away too much of it, but it is the orgasm gap, right? There's this palpable frustration Romy feels at points in the movie, which reflects a broader reality for so many women, especially in long term relationships. I've had the professor and sexuality educator Lori Mintz on the show talking about the orgasm gap. It's a very real thing. Up to 70% of women admit that they've faked an orgasm at least once. And it happens because of disparity in sexual satisfaction between genders that can lead women to feel pressure to perform. Women want to please. And so they want to make their partners feel good. Women's physiology often requires, especially in midlife, slower, more gentler build up for arousal. I've had Sherry Winston on the show talk about the buried maps to our secret treasure, right? And how, in fact, it takes between 30 to 45 minutes of stimulating erogenous or non erogenous zones, especially the clitoris, to reach an orgasm. And many times we can't communicate that, right? We feel like we're taking too long or it's me. Or so many women I find it challenged to communicate their needs or dissatisfaction due to embarrassment or lack of sexual education or fear of hurting their partner's feelings. And we grow up again with misconceptions about what sex is supposed to look like, right? All of that came up in so many scenes in the movie, right? And I wanted to just ask you, how do you approach this issue in your work with couples? What can midlife women do to close the orgasm gap and reclaim their pleasure? This, like I said, has been addressed by Lori Mintz, but I'm curious to hear your take on it.
Well, I think this is such a perfect subject, this topic of baby girl and how I approach it, because I so heavily leave on our body's ability to be imaginative creatures. So it's such a perfect segue for the ways that I approach this that are different than the incredible Dr. Larry Mintz. I love in the film that when we do see Rami orgasm, and again, I don't want to give things away, did you love this too? How primal it is, how
Mm.
guttural it is, how real and true it is. Most of the orgasms we see in mainstream media or in male centered pornography are these, like this whole pretend thing that we've been taught to think is how women are orgasming. And it is wild to me. That is the primary sexuality education for most people in the United States of America, at least. Maybe in some other countries, we're getting better sex ed. But it's so good to watch this woman orgasm in this movie. If you have no other prompting to go see Babygirl, I need you to go see Babygirl to watch the version of one woman's orgasm because we need more of this on camera. We need more of the positions that she is orgasming in because I talk to my clients all the time about the way our nerve endings run all the way down the fronts of our bodies and our cores all the way to our clitorises, and that there's our clusters of nerve endings in various spaces around our vulvas, and it is our job to figure out where those are and then communicate them to a partner if we so desire. So if I was talking with a woman who has been faking orgasms with her partner for 17 years, 5 years, 2 years, 1 year, first and foremost, I would encourage her to take accountability for the lack of truth telling that she has been doing, because that
Mm.
is hers to own. That is hers to own. Now, there are reasons that she has been doing so, such as our need to perform sex, but it is not an excuse. And we should take accountability for that because we are women of character and we can. Okay. Then the next step starts the educational process, which is finding our preferred route to orgasm. For some, it is this deep embodiment experience. For some of my clients, it is a sacred spiritual access route. They truly believe that the more connected, the more tantric, the more spiritually awakened that they are with their partner, the better chance they have of experiencing orgasm. For some of my clients, it is a very romantic journey. The more romantic the evening has been, the more longer the date, the this, that, the other thing, the better they find their body responding to different types of arousal and they find an orgasm achievable. Then I have clients who have done everything, who have read Becoming Clitorate, who have done all the things. And you know the way we find our way to orgasm? Through the erotic mind,
Mm.
through giving ourselves permission to be titillated by the forbidden, to play with a power dynamic in our mind, to put our favorite fantasy, maybe it's a scene from Bridgerton, maybe it's a scene from Babygirl, maybe it's a scene from 50 Shades of Grey, on repeat in our imaginations over and over. I always say, for those of us who know what a record player is, that to that moment where it skips over and over. Our minds are so powerful and they know what we want. And so giving ourselves the permission to live in that erotic space, to live in our fantasy to the point where we can take it no longer. And it is a beautiful piece of permission to give to ourselves. I highly recommend my clients try it on their own first before bringing it to a partner. And I love that we get to see that in the film too, that the way that she has practiced, and I call it a personal pleasure practice, but you can call it whatever you want, then she is able to take that and we see it replicated in a sexual encounter.
Mm.
Wouldn't you know that a way our bodies have learned to enjoy a masturbatory practice and find orgasm within our own physiology is the same way that we see her orgasm in partnered sexual encounters. One of my favorite quotes is that pleasure is not something that we can give or receive. Pleasure is a physiological experience within your own body. And so for you to take ownership and accountability for it, even if that involves, or especially if it involves, your erotic mind, is a gift.
So beautiful. Thank you so much for that. Oh, this conversation has been so rich and so full of insights. Before we wrap up, I want to zoom out and look at the broader implications of a film like Babygirl. For me, this film felt like a cultural shift, a reclaiming of female agency and autonomy, particularly for midlife women. How do you think art like this contributes to the way society views women's desires?
I think films like this give us new narratives. I think that we are storytellers inherently. And when we have only read one script, we don't know that life can be done differently.
So beautifully put, Lauren. I couldn't agree more. And just to add one more thing, those stories, that representation of our stories, seeing women like Romy on screen helps normalize this full spectrum of female sexuality, especially for us midlife women, but for all women. I think we should be teaching our daughters, right? We should be teaching all women that their pleasure matters and that incorporating all aspects of themselves in their sexual expression can be the most freeing, liberating part of being human.
Yes, and amen. Amen and amen. And I think it gives us different ways to consider of our erotic spaces. It allows permission to say, "Oh, I could do that. Oh, I could do that." And I think, again, we said this at the beginning, but I love that it is not tidy. Some other image of perfection that we are supposed to ascribe to, one other thing that we'll never measure up to. I think we need more human stories told. We need to see our sisters stumble and fall. We need to see one another make mistakes that lead to the best lessons we've ever learned. And sometimes life's greatest lessons are messy, and sometimes they lead to the greatest pleasure that we have ever found.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for sharing your wisdom, for sharing your warmth, your passion on this topic. This conversation has been such a gift. I know our listeners will walk away feeling inspired to reflect on their own desires and embrace the fullness of their sexuality. Could you please share with us how our listeners can find you, where they can learn with you?
Yes. Well, if you want to be friends on Instagram, like Gabriella and I are, you can find me at sex_ed_for_you. It's necessary to do all those underscores because Instagram likes to shadow ban people in our area of work. You can also go to sexedforyou.com. And you can also always send me an email at lauren@sexedforyou.com. If something that I have said feels good in your body and you're like, ooh, I want to talk to her more, you can always go to sexedforyou.com/free consult. And we could chat for 15 minutes about the type of work that you are interested in doing in your life. But absolutely no pressure. Connect with me on all of those platforms. I have a podcast with my partner called the Partnership Podcast, and we discuss themes like this often. We have a couple episodes on the erotic mind and exploring fantasy with a long-term partner and these types of things. So if you want to hear more conversations about that, feel free to go there too.
Thank you so much, Lauren, again. And to our listeners, always thank you for joining me on this journey. I'll see you next time on Pleasure in the Pause, where we will continue exploring the power of connection, desire, and purpose in midlife. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Pleasure in the Pause. Want to help me spread more pleasure in the world? Hit the share episode button and send it to a friend or post it on your Instagram stories and tag me, Gabriella Espinosa. And if you really love this podcast, please leave a rating or review, as this helps the show get in front of new listeners. Finally, if you would like to access even more pleasure and stay in touch, sign up for my free pleasure upgrade bundle of powerful mind-body practices by going to pleasureinthepause.com. Remember, your pleasure matters.